Okay guys, so we're going to go through how to adjust the height of the tubes in the water uptake assembly. Obviously I've removed the main cover of the DE1. All you'll do is remove the 4 Torx T10 size Torx screws on either side of the case and then slide the cover off forward or backward. It doesn't matter whichever is the easiest for you. Sometimes it helps to leverage the cover out a bit and then from the bottom and then slide it out if it feels a bit sticky. Next, we want to make sure that we have a couple of things. Parts bowl just to hold your screws and the knob for the uptake when we're moving it. Fine marker. This is a double-sided Sharpie. There's a thick end and a fine end. I'm going to use the fine end. A 2mm hex key. You could use a key type, or it's also called an Allen key for those in the States. I prefer to use a driver type. It's a little bit easier to manipulate for this, but you could do it with a key type. You'll need 2 either credit cards or membership cards. It helps if they're not embossed, but if all you have is 2 credit cards that have embossed writing on them, that's fine. The basic idea is we want about 2 millimeters of thickness, and then the water tank from the machine removed and empty and clean. So we'll start, now that we've got the cover off, we'll lift up the uptake just a bit. I'm holding the tube on top with my left hand, and I'm going to remove the uptake knob with my right hand and pop that in the parts bowl. Now we'll lift the slider assembly just as far up as it goes. And next I'm going to, you'll need to just angle it a bit to get it around the bracket up here. But now that it's up, I'm going to remove the thimble filter at the bottom of the water uptake. And when you do this, water will pour out because it breaks the vacuum inside the tube. So do have a paper towel or rag handy to catch some of the water under the machine. If you don't even know this part existed or you've never cleaned it, this is a great time to clean it. This is really important because if this very, very fine mesh filter gets clogged up, the pumps will start to struggle to produce the flow rates because they are working against a vacuum or some back pressure depending on what the situation is in there. This is the air pressure sensor that takes the water level in the tank. There's a water uptake tube, the thicker one with the different arches in the bottom. There's kind of notches in the bottom of the tube. And then the other tube, the angled bottom tube, is the air column for the air pressure sensor. And that's why there's a little silicone tube that goes from the top of that column to a barb on the air pressure sensor. So just be careful when you're manipulating this whole assembly not to tear these wires or knock the connector out or anything like that. So just take a bit of care. So now we're going to move this silicone tube that feeds the pumps just out of the way a little bit and turn the assembly full 90 degrees so that we have access to these grub screws. And these grub screws are what set the height of the assembly. You can see that at 90 degrees, the bottom of the slider tube can rest comfortably on the silicone tube for the intake of the plumbing kit and the catering kit. And that's a good little support for us to do our work now. Next, we'll just loosen the 4 grub screws that hold this in place. You can see I've already loosened the bottom 2 just to speed this up a little bit. So I've loosened my grub screws now, and you can see that the tubes are free to slide up and down in the POM body. And that's where we'd like it. So we'll leave that resting there for a moment. Now we'll move on to our water tank. We'll take our 2 cards that we talked about earlier, place them in the bottom of the tank on the right-hand rear corner of the tank where the water uptake would enter. And we're going to use those to set the height of the uptake. That's why that 2 millimeter height is important. Now we'll lift the uptake and the slider body and swivel it back into position and lower it down into the tank. Now we'll just lift the body a little bit And we need to put the knob back in the uptake assembly so that it sets the minimum height for the slider body. Once that's all in there, you'll see that the tube is just resting on the bottom of the tank. It goes down so far and then stops. There is a notch on the tube where the set height should be. However, the tanks, being made of ceramic, are organic and they do vary a bit. So sometimes the tanks are a little deeper or a little bit shallower. So I tend to not use the notch. Instead, I'll just mark it with a fine pen or a marker. Mark your level, and if you can get in there and mark the level on the other tube, then you're all set. Now that you've done that, remove the knob from the slider assembly again, and we will swivel the assembly 90 degrees so we have access to those grub screws again. And you can see there's my mark, and I'm just going to set the tube, the slider on the tube, to my mark, and then tighten one grub screw. Next, we will do the same for the air uptake, and that's about right. And I will tighten the grub screw on the air uptake as well. Once I've got one grub screw tightened, now on both tubes, I can tighten the other one. It doesn't have to be super tight. There's two of them. This really isn't under any kind of force. So just a loose tension, maybe, I don't know, maybe one or two Newton meters is all it really needs. It's just hand tight. Okay, so now that the tube heights are set, we can check that everything is all good by removing our cards from the tank and putting the tank back in, and very carefully lowering the slider while holding it. Put the knob, we'll need to replace the thimble. So we'll put the thimble filter back into the bottom of the water uptake, hopefully cleaned. And now we'll begin to lower the water uptake assembly and replace the knob into the slider body and just lower it until it reaches its lowest. And if you're not hearing any contact with the tank, you've set it correctly. We do want to be careful that there is no contact with the tank, because if you were to slip and let this fall, you don't want those two steel tubes cracking the tank. But as long as you follow all those steps, that will be the minimum height that you could set those sliders, and it will allow the deepest water uptake position so that you will have the longest drawdown for the tank.